Hey everyone, in a prior video I talked about 4 Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition things we lost when we moved to 5th edition. I mentioned in that video how powers was probably the biggest lost and it deserved a video of its own. And so today I want to talk about 3 reasons why I wish Dungeons & Dragons still used powers. Before I get into the reasons, let me first cover what powers are for those that might be unfamiliar. Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition greatly simplified how characters were played by consolidating many of their special abilities into powers. Each power had an action that the character would take and then some benefit they would receive. For example, a fighter had a power called Cleave. When using this power, they would make an attack against another creature, but you would also be able to deal damage equal to your strength modifier to an adjacent enemy. Some powers used different types of attacks, others granted interesting benefits, others granted benefits even if you missed. They were a really interesting way to do cool things. So let's look at some specific reasons why I wish they were still used. First of all, options. At first level and most levels after that, you got to choose at least one new power. You could also exchange a power for another as you leveled up. You rarely had fewer than 4 or 5 options to choose from, and all of them had really interesting things that they did. For example, let's say that I'm a fighter moving up to level 2. I have 4 powers to choose from. Boundless Endurance, which uses a minor action and allows you to regain 2 plus your Constitution modifier hit points at the start of every turn when you're bloodied. Or Get Over Here, where you use your move action to slide an ally that is adjacent to you up to 2 squares to another square that is adjacent to you. No Opening allows you to cancel out any combat advantage that another creature had on you. And Unstoppable was a minor action to grant yourself 2d6 plus your Constitution modifier in temporary hit points. These are all really cool powers that could come in handy for a fighter. Multiply this by the number of classes and the number of levels that grant powers and you can see how many options there were. I love looking through the book to see what my character might be able to do at the higher levels. There were always tough choices to make. The combinations made it so that you could make a bunch of fighters, but each one would have a different flavor based on the powers that were chosen at each level. Next is what I call accessibility. If you look at players that are new to Dungeons & Dragons, you'll find that a lot of them choose to play a fighter as their first character. Maybe a rogue if they're especially adventurous. Most brand new Dungeons & Dragons players, and I mean those that have never played a role-playing game before, will stay away from the magic user classes because there's a bit of a learning curve for them. 4th edition eliminated that. D&D 4th edition had no prepare spells or spell slots. Wizard spells are powers that work just like powers for every other class. Now, some might say that this is one of the reasons why they don't like 4th edition, but spell slots didn't exist until 3rd edition anyway, so I never understood why this was a big deal when they went away. While fighters did fighter things and had appropriate powers, wizards had spells that did spell things, like light and invisibility and magic missile. Most of the wizard spells in 4th edition are the same with similar implementations as in prior versions. But using powers to cast spells made those classes much more approachable for new players. No longer were magic users or some other more exotic classes something best left to the experienced players. The mechanics you used to play a fighter were the same as those you used to play a wizard. The standard way of playing the characters using powers immediately made all the classes accessible to everyone regardless of your level of experience. And finally, creativity. Another knock on Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition was that it made all the characters the same. I disagree. The mechanics were greatly simplified and standardized, but the powers each class had were very different and how they were used was still up to each player. Each power had some flavor text that gave an indication of what it looked like. This is often all a player needs to really run with a crazy description of what they're doing. And let's not forget that so often encounters turn into people just standing around hitting each other. A bunch of powers had special abilities that moved characters and monsters around the battlefield. This helped to encourage players to move and see possibilities that they might not have thought of on their own. And often powers were not just attack versus a target's armor class. It might be intelligence versus reflex, or charisma versus reflex, or dexterity versus armor class. This meant that you used more of your character sheet, and it provided even more ways that a player could use their powers in very specific ways to take on an enemy that they might otherwise struggle with. All of these things made powers a great tool to help players find creative ways to solve problems, and they really made combat dynamic and interesting. I think powers were a great mechanic. I'm sad that they were so quickly abandoned. What do you think? What else do you love about 4th edition powers that I didn't cover here? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. Until next time, take care.